Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight. We will get started in just a couple minutes. Hi, everyone. Hope you are doing well this week. Thank you so much for coming this evening or this morning, wherever you are in the world. Tonight's session will be about getting round one ready. It is your MBA application pre-submission checklist. So if you are applying in round one for an MBA, your timing is great. If you're applying later, hopefully this information is useful for you too. So whenever you are applying, this information should facilitate your process. That said, this is the last of my admissions webinars before the round one deadlines next month. Just so you know, the session will be recorded and sent to you in the coming days. So before we get started on tonight's agenda, I will take some time. I'll tell you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from. My name is Laura Nelson. I have a BFA from Carnegie Mellon University, where I studied art, and I'm also a full-time MBA graduate of the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan, where I was a member of the admissions committee. Before business school, I worked in film and TV, and I had a very nonlinear path going into business school and coming out of school as well. After graduation, I entered the tech industry for over a decade, where I held general management roles and most recently as VP of marketing at a software startup. My last two companies exited through acquisition, and today I am a fractional marketing executive. Alongside that, though, I have been an MBA admissions consultant for 16 years with two of the top consulting firms and now with TTP. I've steered hundreds of MBA clients to top programs. And the final thing I want to acknowledge on this slide is that I'm a member of an organization called AGAC, which gives me direct access to both admissions committee members and career officers at top programs. So as you can imagine, I have worked on every MBA application across all the top programs, across all of the logos you see on this slide, and certainly some that you do not see on this slide. So now that you know a little more than you need to know about me, let's dive into today's agenda. So here are the things that I plan to cover in our pre-MBA application submission checklist. So first, I'm going to cover common mistakes to avoid in your MBA applications. So again, if you are applying round one, you're probably deep into the process by now, and maybe you're tackling the essay writing process. We're going to focus on the do's and don'ts in the following areas of your application. So this includes your resume. We will touch on the essays. We'll talk about test scores and transcripts and conclude this section with your recommendations. After that, though, I am going to talk about your short answers, optional questions, and video questions. Then I'm going to run through a final pre-submission checklist. And before we go into Q&A, I am going to talk about the benefits of getting a second opinion from a seasoned MBA admissions consultant. And then at the end, I will leave time for your questions. But don't wait to the end. You know, if you want something clarified as we move along in today's conversation, please feel free to use the chat. I will be watching this as we go along. And if for whatever reason I miss your question and you want to know the answer at the end, please feel free to reshare that in the chat. Okay, so thanks again for joining, and hopefully this agenda is aligned with what you were hoping for in tonight's webinar. So first, let's start with common mistakes in MBA applications. So I've grouped these major mistakes across some of the major application materials, and I really want to encourage you not to fall into these traps. You will be in a much stronger position with your MBA applications if you avoid these mistakes. And if you're applying in round one and making those finishing touches on your applications, hopefully these tips will really come in handy. If you're applying later, round two or beyond, these are the things that you should be watching out for in your process. So first, let's start with your resume. I'm going to talk about two big mistakes that I see in application resumes. And the first mistake that I see concerns your bullet points. So often, when I start work with clients, I get resumes that detail day-to-day job responsibilities rather than professional achievements. And what I want to impress upon you tonight is that the MBA resume, it's different from your current job search resume, and you really need to showcase where you've driven impact professionally and quantify this impact using metrics wherever possible. If you don't have metrics, that's totally okay. So not all of your bullet points are going to have metrics, but if it is something that is to be measured, maybe you can use an approximation or description of the result. Just make sure that you are leading the admissions committee toward an outcome that helps them understand where you've made an impact professionally and what you've done. Do not forget to include any initiatives where you've stepped outside your day-to-day role and made a difference at your organization. So this can be your work in employee resource groups, on special projects, and on other committees. The goal here really is to showcase when you've taken initiative and been a leader, and you do not need to be in a formal leadership position to do so. So that's the first mistake that I see in resumes. The second mistake I see is just that they're hard to read. So I do not recommend that you go below 10 or 11 point font. And I know this is really tricky to do because most programs want a one-page resume, but you really have to curate your experiences to match the audience. Take into account that audience. This is skilled admissions readers, but sometimes I see too much industry jargon. So you have to keep in mind that MBA admissions committees, they're very well-rounded, but they are not necessarily experts in your particular field. So if your resume has a ton of abbreviations, it has a ton of industry terms, take a step back and really evaluate if someone outside your company or industry will understand it. This is not to say I want you to dumb down your resume, but I just want to make sure that the language in your resume will translate to or be able to be understood by someone who is not in your industry. And this is where an admissions consultant can really come in handy to ensure your resume is written for the right audience. So good question from Colin in the chat. The question is, without decreasing margins, like should we leave more margins than a normal resume? I do not think that you need to leave more margins, Colin. There are some programs that get very specific and want to see 1-inch margins, but that is an area that, I play with my clients too, right? If we are able to bump out a little of the margins on the side to fit everything to a page, that is one of the tricks that you can employ. Similarly, header and footer, do you need a full inch? Do you need to take up all that real estate? You certainly don't need to put your address in. You can just keep it to your name, phone number, and LinkedIn. So that's a very good question, and definitely play around with what looks good and what fits all of your relevant information. So those are the things to avoid on your resume. Next, I want to spend some time tackling the biggest mistakes that I see in essays. And I would say this first one is the most common I see across all of them, right? It is the failure to answer the right question. And I know this sounds like really basic, but this does happen a lot. So, for example, Some MBA essay prompts ask candidates more than one thing. If you're applying to Kellogg, for example, there's a lot to answer in that first essay prompt. And sometimes candidates like put blinders on and they're in a rush and kind of glaze over part of the question. And you can miss that, right? And then you miss your opportunity to talk about what impact you're bringing to Kellogg, for example. Another example, if a question asks about your short-term and long-term goals, be sure to provide that admissions committee with the full picture. If the question asks what you hope to get out of the program and what you intend to contribute, you've got to address both parts. So again, there's a lot of opportunities to overlook what you're being asked in these applications. And I think the number one reason that people fail to answer the right question is because either they're rushing or they're answering the question that they wish was asked. And you really need to give yourself some time to evaluate what that question is answering and ensuring that you are providing a sufficient answer there. The next thing that I want to cover in the essay section is about articulating your career goals. And this is really important, especially in today's market, because MBA admissions committees want to ensure that you are successful in their program and that you are going to land a job. So if you are writing about career goals that are vague or unrealistic, you are not going to build confidence with the admissions committee. All right. They might question whether you've done your homework and whether you've done the right preparation for this next phase of your education and your career. So you've really got to make sure that your career goals are specific and realistic. So here's an example of a non-specific career. Say you want to go into finance and you just say, my goal post MBA is to go into finance. The problem with that type of goal is that finance is a broad industry. So you've got to break it down further from there. What do I mean by that? Do you want to go into investment banking? Are you pursuing private equity? Are you interested in asset management or corporate finance? You've got to get specific with the area of finance because then you've got to name a couple target companies alongside that, right? So like that's the level of specificity you need. What area of finance? What are your target companies? An example of an unrealistic goal is expecting a huge transition from one career to another. So I mentioned a minute ago that today's market is demanding different things, right? We're seeing smaller leaps across career pivoters, right? It's really challenging to change your industry and your function. So an example of an unrealistic career goal is expecting to transition from something like being an artist to an investment banker without any track record in quantitative subjects or any experience working at a financial institution, right? Because I use that example because that's sort of my background, and it would have been very difficult and unrealistic for me to go into investment banking post MBA. So you've got to make sure that some elements of your past career will transfer to your new career. You've got a question in the chat, so I will take that. If our post-MBA career is a bit untraditional from the standard post-MBA industries, would that fall under unrealistic goals? Not necessarily, Armando. I think that's a good question, right? And I do not discourage non-traditional post-MBA goals. I think what's important here, if you are pursuing something a little off the beaten path from what your cohort is, and that's totally fine. You just have to talk about why you want an MBA, how the MBA is going to help facilitate your career transition, and which skills and experiences are going to transfer to that goal too. So that's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up. The next mistake on essays, and this can pop up in short answers as well, but I have grouped it in this section, is the failure to demonstrate your fit with the MBA program that you're applying to. So there are some applications that ask very specific questions about why you want to attend that program and how that program is going to progress your professional and personal goals. So often they'll also ask what you intend to contribute to the cohort. So for this, it is really critical that you gain an understanding of each MBA program, including their academic offerings, their initiatives, their extracurricular programming, their unique cultures, and tailor your response accordingly. So your answer for a program like Wharton is going to be different than it is for a program like Stanford. So you've got to do your homework and make sure that your responses are tailored to that program and that program only. And I will also say that, there is a temptation when you're talking about offerings for a program and trying to relate your fit to, repeat what that offering is. So say, for example, you're putting the class description in your essay. I would caution against that, right? Like the admissions committee knows what that class is all about. The more valuable information in there to talk about, it really is like what you want to get out of that class, right? How that class is relevant to your development goals and to your career goals. So I know that's a lot. This is a broad area, and I know like candidates spend a lot of time on essays. So I'm happy to take more questions about essays now, or as they pop up, feel free to put them in the chat. I'm going to move on to the test scores and transcripts area, because I know also like this is a tough area for some candidates because we can't rewrite our transcripts, and the tests can be a challenging area to surmount as well. Got a question in the chat. I will take this now. Thank you, Mauricio. How long should you dedicate to an essay per application? That's a great question, and the answer really depends on, what research you've put in, how strong of a writer you are, how many iterations you need. I've seen this depend, right? Like I've worked with candidates who have done as few as, say, 3 iterations of their essay, and it's come together in a few short weeks. I've seen other candidates who have worked on essays, maybe 15, 20 drafts, and we worked on it for a couple months. And obviously, like the more challenging or more esoteric essays like Stanford, take a lot of thought and iteration. So all of that to say, it really just depends on the person, and there's no hard and fast rule. But I will say it is, really challenging to do this in a week because of all of the underlying research and thought and deliberation that goes into these essays. This is a strategic part of your MBA application, and there's one aspect of the writing process, but all of the thought and deliberation that comes before it will feed into your essays, and that's what makes it a bit more challenging, I think. So, good question. But we will move on to the test scores and transcripts. First, starting with the mistake of a low test score, right? And, I'll caveat this by saying if your test score is lower than the accepted range from the prior year's class, you may be shooting yourself in the foot by applying to this program. Of course, test scores aren't the end all be all, but you really have to leverage the information that you read about in the class profile to understand, where you are placing in comparison to the last class. If you can, maximize your chances of getting your best score, either by retaking the test or taking another exam. And I get this question where people ask, should I take the GMAT or GRE? Is the GMAT valued more than the GRE? Most programs accept the GRE and really do not care whether you take the GMAT or GRE. Additionally, some programs accept the EA or the executive assessment. And my recommendation, if you haven't gotten into the test prep process yet, is to take a diagnostic across multiple tests and see which one really suits your capabilities. See which one, leans into your strengths. And, after you benchmark your scores, like, you'll have a direction on which may be the right direction for you to take. So, on that note, do the best you can, right? A great score is not going to get you in. It's not going to guarantee admission to a great MBA program, but it is not going to keep you out of the running, right? So this is just one component of your MBA application. Here's another question about when to apply. So the question is, have you seen from your best knowledge a difference in applying in round one and round two with being admitted? I have not. So I get this question often as well. Do you have an advantage in, is there significant difference in admissions from round one and round two? No. Round two tends to be the biggest round across most MBA programs. And, if your application, all things being equal, I do encourage people to apply to round one just because you get a fresh admissions committee. But more importantly, you get the opportunity to apply to more programs in round two if your top choice in round one doesn't work out. So, my recommendations are really more around the timing and strategy of applications. But, if your application is going to be stronger in round two, that is when I recommend that you apply. There's a question about Ross's QRC versus GMAT if needed. And, the general question here is about testing, submitting a test waiver. And, I've worked with many candidates who have been successful with the test waiver process. And, that has just taken the test constraint or it's the test burden, I shall say, out of the equation when they apply. So, my thoughts are if you have the background to support your quantitative capabilities and you want to, go ahead and submit your statement of academic readiness for a program like Ross or Darden or others that offer this option, I encourage it, right? They have the criteria listed out on the site. They're looking for professional certifications, strong performance in undergrads, especially in quantitative subjects, and also, strong quantitative performance professionally. And, if you meet those criteria, give it a shot. No guarantee you'll get the waiver, but if you meet some of those criteria and write a strong essay, like you will, get a good look at it anyways. The next question is about statement of purpose. Should you prepare different statements of purpose with only subtle differences changing according to the college's motto, or should you just prepare one and send it to every college? So I hope my message in the essay session was clear, but I will repeat it. You have to create essay responses for each unique program's prompts. They are not looking for a general statement of purpose. They have different prompts, different questions, and different offerings, and you have different essay lengths to respond to those. So, it's really important that you understand the differences across these programs and that you communicate that through your written essays. So, you will have major differences across your essays for each of these. And this is specific to the MBA programs. I'm aware that there are other master's programs that will take a general statement of purpose, but I'm speaking specifically to the top MBA programs, which have their own unique criteria. I mentioned a minute ago that transcripts cannot be rewritten once you've graduated undergrad. But I do think there are opportunities in your application to address a low GPA or poor grades in your academic record. It is possible to overcome these issues if you provide context for your academic record and your application. For example, if you had some personal setbacks during your undergrad experience, I'd recommend providing some details about your situation somewhere. This will likely go in your optional essay. If your weak performance was in quant-related courses and you haven't done much in this area since, you might consider taking a quant-based course like stats, econ, or accounting and getting an A. You could also take a course like MBA math. You need to remember that an MBA is as much about the academic experience as it is the professional development opportunity. And the admissions committee wants to understand that you can handle the curriculum of the program. So by providing more information in your application, you're going to provide the admissions committee with the full picture of, what was happening in your undergraduate years if this applies to your situation. So that's a little bit about test scores and transcripts. I'm going to move on to recommendations. And, I've got a couple key points here. And the first one relates to your selection of recommenders. Do not choose the wrong recommender. So if you choose someone who isn't your immediate supervisor, make sure the admissions committee knows why. And there are usually places in your applications to do that. You always want to provide them context if you are going, a little bit against their rules. So, make sure you read those forms carefully and, provide a little bit of context in the application itself. So that form may be on the recommendation page, or, it might be part of your optional essay. The other key point I want to make about recommendations is that, if you choose the wrong recommender or your recommender isn't set up for success, your recommendation may not support your application, or it may not be a value add to your application. So if your recommender is providing generic and non-specific feedback, this is often the case when your recommender doesn't know you too well or hasn't directly supervised you in a professional setting. Some candidates think that an MBA recommendation will be more effective if it comes from the CEO or someone else at your company with a big title. If that happens to be your supervisor, that is fine. But sometimes the person with the big title, who's a few layers removed from your daily work, won't have the specificity they need to write a really impactful recommendation. The admissions committee is asking for feedback from your direct supervisor so that they can understand the nuances of your performance and how it compares to that of your peers and how you respond to feedback. And, they want an assessment of your professional potential, among other things. So I think it's really important to get the right recommender, set them up for success, and ensure that they have enough runway to submit their recommendation on time. So any questions about recommendations? Because I know that this area can cause like trepidation for some candidates. So feel free to add that in the chat. And, as you think about that, I will move on to the next item on our agenda. And I'm going to talk about three key areas of your application that some candidates leave to the last minute, but I think they demand a little more attention and planning. So Candace has a question about recommendations, about guiding recommenders in this process. Great question, and I'll take the time to answer that now while we are still sort of on the topic of recommendations. In that, I think it's really important first that your recommender understands why you want to go to business school. If they do not have buy-in to your process, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to write a convincing recommendation and support your candidacy. So that's the first one. Um, for guiding them, I have worked with candidates who have created either a one-pager cheat sheet or a whole packet of information to support the recommender's process. I think it's helpful when you, the candidate, know what questions are asked as part of the recommendation and provide some bullet points, right? Provide some examples that can support your performance relative to that of your peers, can support a time that you received feedback, can articulate some of your strengths and some of your wins professionally that kind of have happened under your recommender's purview, because I think that makes it just so much more easy for that, person to pull from examples if, they're starting from, a list of things to choose rather than a blank slate. Another way that your recommenders can be supported is, if you're working with an admissions consultant, this has certainly been the case with me. Like sometimes I talk directly with recommenders, and, just help articulate like what the admissions committee is looking for and, help walk them through the process. Some of them feel comfortable sending me the recommendation. I'll provide feedback on that, but not only is that like a tactical level of support for them, but also, it just makes them feel more confident in, what they're writing and how they're supporting the candidate. And then the final note I will make on that, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, is like giving them enough time to do it. I recommend typically my clients to give their recommenders 4 to 6 weeks to write the recommendation. It's enough time for them to plan around vacations and big projects, but not enough time to kick it up down the road too far where they absolutely forget about it. So sometimes it helps, if you know that your recommender is a procrastinator and will do it on the last day, give your recommender a false deadline. So, tell your recommender it's due 5 days before it's actually due, because, the worst thing that can happen is your recommendation's late. And, if it is too late, your application will be moved into the next round. So don't let your recommender hold your application hostage. And hopefully that was some, useful feedback that you can take to your recommender to ensure that your process stays on track. So let's shift gears to these short answers, optional essays, and video questions. First, starting with the short answers. So for each of these sections, I'm going to talk about why they're important, the approach, and offer a pro tip on these. Short answers are important because this gives you the opportunity to kind of set the stage through your data form and tell the admissions committee who you are. The good thing about this is like you do not have to write full essays and stories. You are not going to use verbose language. Instead, you are going to be clear and concise and just give the facts about your experiences, activities, awards, goals, etc. So this is really not the time to be creative with your language. But here is a pro tip, because you will see in your application forms that you are asked about kind of what your job is and day-to-day responsibilities. And I think it's a big mistake just to copy and paste resume bullet points from your resume to your work experience section. So your resume is going to detail achievements at your job and, throughout your career so far. And the short answer section really is designed to provide context about your role or about your roles. So this is the opportunity to talk about some of your day-to-day responsibilities, the stakeholders you work with, and some other information that did not find a place on your resume, right? So I know that, short answers can sometimes feel annoying or redundant, but, you can be really strategic on what you provide and, how that supports your candidacy. Question from Mauricio. The short answer questions are part of the resume or part of the application itself. Mauricio, they are part of the application itself. So you will have your one-page resume and there will be supplemental questions, kind of similar to when you are applying for a job and you have to do a little of what seems like redundant work. You will have to do that in your MBA application as well. But my main point here is not to cut and paste the same information. So let's talk about the optional questions or optional essays in this next section. You do have the opportunity to provide further detail that is not addressed elsewhere in the application. So I think this is important. We talked about undergraduate performance. We talked about the selection of your recommender. Like this is where it can go in your application. But all schools are different. They have different, word count lengths. They have different things they want to see here. So my recommendation is to follow the specific instructions and, provide the information that they are asking for. So in other words, this is not an opportunity to include an essay that you wrote for another program and loved, right? You've got to stick to the spirit of the optional essay and just cover things that help to fill in the gaps for the admissions committee. So for example, I mentioned undergrad performance and, if you had a weakness in your profile, such as a low GPA or test score, you have the opportunity to provide context to this situation, right? I talked with a client earlier today who said he was working 2 jobs and he was involved in all of these extracurriculars. And, we are going to develop the optional essay to explain that situation in brief and how it impacted his undergrad GPA. The last item I will address in this section is the video questions. So I know they cause a lot of anxiety for candidates, but they're a real opportunity for you to showcase communication skills, demonstrate your spontaneous speaking abilities, and show off your personalities. So what is the approach here? I would practice, right? If the video essay causes anxiety for you, practice recording yourself or in front of a mirror, right? When it comes time to record, you can relax and be yourself, but this is really not the time to either wing it or to count on reading from a script or work from ChatGPT, right? So, it can be really useful to record yourself to understand how you're speaking, understand, tone, speed, all of those things so that, it becomes second nature when you are recording these spontaneous questions. And, unless you're submitting a pre-recorded video, and I know there are some, say for instance, like for Haas or Sloan, there are others that, require you to record them spontaneously. And I do want to warn you that admissions committees know when you are cheating at this, right? Like when you're looking up ChatGPT or you're reading something pre-written. So please know that they're not looking for perfection here. It is better to stay present, to stay in the moment, and to do your best. Know that other candidates are going to be in the same boat as well. I think this is really important too because, verbal communication is so important in business school. You will be doing presentations, you'll be doing interviews, and I think the video interview is the closest mechanism we have to the job search interview today, right? Like you will not be writing essays about yourself to get your internship or your full-time job, but you will be on Zoom, you will be pre-recording responses, you will be using these skills. So, I think it's really important to become comfortable with that and to, get this nailed down now, or at least advance your current skill set. Got a question in the chat about low GPA. Does it matter if it's STEM? I think that's an excellent point. So low GPA, like this is relative, right? And this is an area where there's a lot of nuance. I am aware that, some undergraduate programs, great on the curve and everyone gets inflated grades. However, some are very competitive and, a certain GPA that may be considered low generally is really strong for that program. So, MBA admissions committees are aware of this and how competitive some programs are. So, I can't give you exact advice because I don't know your exact situation. So, all of that to say it really depends. I think a STEM undergrad doesn't generally hurt you in this process, but we'd have to discuss, the degrees of difference, so the degrees of magnitude you are from the average or the median GPA of the most recent class. So next, I want to talk about our pre-submission checklist. Of course, those do's and don'ts that I discussed already are big parts of, how you evaluate and refine your MBA application materials. And in this last section, I'm just going to run through some of the must-dos before you hit submit in your application. The reason for this is like there is nothing worse than seeing a huge typo in your resume or somewhere else in your application proof after you've submitted. So, if you can, allow yourself a couple of days to work through this pre-submission checklist. And the first thing I recommend is to proofread your full application with fresh eyes. So, this is not the same night that you've iterated 3 times on Harvard's essays. This is a day or two after you put down your essays, that you've downloaded the proof of your application, and when you can return to this with fresh eyes. So you are going to have to finish the application and your essays before they are due. But, it really gives you the opportunity to, return to your writing with a fresh perspective and catch some things like grammar, like spelling that you may have overlooked several times over. Another thing, and you can do this maybe simultaneously with, proofreading your application. I know this sounds incredibly cheesy, but it helps to read your essays out loud. The MBA admissions committee, they really want to understand how you communicate. And, that's verbally, of course. We talked about the videos, but, in the written word is also really important. So I think by reading something out loud, you can more effectively identify, verbiage and phrasing that doesn't make sense or doesn't sound like you. Maybe it comes off awkwardly, so you get that opportunity to fix things. Another thing I want to remind you is that a lot of people read things like in their head as they read stories or essays. So keep that in mind. If it sounds like really awkward when you're reading something to yourself or out loud, it may come across the same way to the admissions committee readers. Next thing, it's pretty basic, but make sure your recommenders have submitted their items. Like typically, you will get that confirmation from the platform, but if you've not received that, double check and then check back with your recommenders. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the risk here is that if your recommendation is not received, your application could be pushed into a future round. So, do not count on that grace period. There is a small one, but, really impressed upon your recommenders that this should be submitted and done on time. Next thing that I think is super important is to review your social media accounts. Make sure there's nothing crazy and public out there that you don't want the admissions team to see. So this is fair game, especially LinkedIn. So make sure that your professional experience section tells the same story that your resume does. You do not need to have all of your bullet points in your LinkedIn, and I prefer them not to be there, but make sure that the roles and the companies and your dates are consistent with your resume and with what you put in the application data form too. I also think it's helpful to Google yourself and, make sure you take control of any information that's out there. If there are any egregious posts from social media that are public, this may be surfaced in, the evaluation of their application uh, through the admissions process or later with a background check. So if you're wondering, yes, I have found things about my clients that were not disclosed in our process. And, there are some things that a quick Google search can really kill in candidacies. So, make sure you take a look and clean up what you can. The last point I want to add here is to get a second opinion on your application. So you can do this in a few different ways, right? First, you can enlist a friend or family member to review your application, ensure that your stories come across in a logical and authentic way. One thing I'll caution here is that if your reader isn't well versed in MBA admissions, this could derail your application, right? If they are suggesting major changes about your strategy, about your career goals, etc. So you may want to contain the scope of that review and tell that person just to check for logic and grammar and spelling. Another option here is you can enlist one of Target Test Prep's experienced admissions consultants to give your application a read, provide detailed feedback. If you are applying for round one, you do still have time to do this. So if you're thinking about this, definitely take action soon. Either way, you're going to get help from, another perspective to find errors, help you avoid common mistakes, and help put your best foot forward for this process. And I'm going to expand a little bit just on the value of working with an experienced admissions consultant. You may be wondering, what can someone like Laura help me with? As I mentioned, I've worked with hundreds of candidates. I've seen it all, from good to bad, right? And my advisor really goes beyond copy editing and dives into the strategy of your candidacy. So as I mentioned, if you are applying in round one, I can help spot these issues we discussed tonight and provide a sanity check for your application. And if you are just getting started with your process, I can partner with you from end to end and really help you develop that personal brand, your career goals, your school list, and every aspect of your MBA application. So, there are different ways that we can work together, and I'm happy to share a little more about that. But I do want to give you the opportunity to get into Q&A. I've gone a little long on this, so I will skip over this information because, I can provide that to you as well. So if you have questions that, you've been holding for this section, please feel free to use the chat feature. If you are interested in exploring the possibility of working together, I have my email address here. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me. There's a few pieces of information I've listed here that would be helpful to know before we talk. And you also have the opportunity to save 10% if you sign up in the next 7 days. So, I will leave this information here, but feel free to dive in with the chat. Is there anything that we discussed that you're still wondering, or any other topics, outside of what we've discussed tonight that, would help you and your process? Please let me know. Quiet group tonight. You did have some great questions throughout. So, I understand if you want to drop, but please feel free to follow up if there's anything you want to discuss one-on-one. I will hang out here for a few more seconds, and hopefully this was useful to you. Hopefully you're on track if you're submitting in round one. I wish you the best of luck if we do not chat. And I know this is it's a tough process and it's a long road. So I hope that you are successful in no matter which direction you want to pursue. A couple of questions popped up. Can we go back to the resume and the recommendations slide, please? Sure. Is this something that you want to get a screenshot of, or do you have some specific questions on resume? There will be a recording sent about this session. Usually we're pretty quick, I would say by the end of the week at the latest, but feel free to take a screenshot here. So I've got resumes here. Um, and then you asked for the recommendations. Here's that slide for you to take a screenshot. While I wait on that slide, I will answer this question about work experience. If I have the average years of experience, but I'm currently out of a job, what would you recommend to say in the application? So thank you for bringing this up, Rodrigo. Um, it used to be just a few years ago, like the kiss of death to apply for an MBA program while you were not working. But things really changed with COVID. A lot of people were out of work. We saw a lot of change in the job market, and that really hasn't changed in the last few years. Right? We're seeing contraction across industries. We're seeing people take longer in between jobs just because there's fewer jobs out there across many industries. So, my recommendation to you, Rodrigo, is that you talk about all of the things that you are doing to, in the meantime, right? Talk about how you're actively searching for a job, if that applies to your situation, how you are keeping up with volunteering, extracurriculars, other activities in your life as it applies, and what you're doing to upskill, research programs, etc. You have to keep other things in your life going. It is not enough to say, I quit my job or I'm only focusing on the MBA application and nothing else during this time. That tends not to be looked at favorably from admissions committees, and often the majority of the class is applying and doing all of these activities while working their full-time job. So, as long as you're keeping these other activities active in your life, that's what I recommend addressing either as part of your optional essay or elsewhere in your application. But that's a good question. All right, I will leave this screen up for a couple more seconds. Thank you guys again for coming and asking these great questions. Hope this was helpful for you. Have a great rest of your Wednesday night, and I'll talk to some of you soon. Take care.